The first cruelty of the season was meant to be a private matter, spoken low in a corridor where the candles guttered, and no one of consequence was expected to pass. But Evienne Marchbrook heard every word. She heard the Duke of Ashenfell say her name as if it were a debt he had grown tired of carrying, and she heard the woman beside him laugh the short, bright laugh of someone who has already been promised a chair at a table where another woman still sat. She did not turn. She did not lower her head. She did not give them the satisfaction of a sound. Ashenfell House, in the 17th year of the young king's reign, at the hour when the West Wing had begun to hush itself for the evening, the corridor breathed as corridors do when they have learned to be discreet, drawing its long lung of dust and beeswax and cold stone through her skirts. The gilt on the wainscoting caught the candlelight and threw it back thinned and yellow, a light that flattered every liar in the house and made honest faces look ill. She stood where she had stopped, half a pace from the servant's door she had come through, with a folded ledger under her arm. And she counted, without meaning to, the small honest sounds the house made around the two voices at the far end of the passage, the tick of a case clock 2 rooms away, the shift of a log in a distant grate, the soft complaint of a floorboard that had been complaining in that same tone since she had first set foot in this house as a bride. Useful, that was the word the Duke had used. He had said that she had been useful, as one said of a stout table one no longer wished to keep. The word arrived in her ear at the exact moment her hand rose. On its own, to the small ring at her throat, a ring worn on a plain black cord, because her mother had worn it on a plain black cord, and had told her, when she was 7 years old and afraid of a thunderstorm, that a woman who could keep her hands still could keep her house standing. It was not a beautiful ring. It was silver, gone soft gray with age. Its band thinned at the back, where 40 years of a farmwife's washing water had worn it. Its stone a plain river garnet, the color of steeped tea, cut in a shape that had gone out of fashion before Evienne had been born. It had no place in a house of enamel and pearl and rose-cut diamond. It knew, however, her name. In the corridor, at the far end, the woman who had laughed said something Evienne did not catch, and the Duke answered in the voice he used for stewards and for horses that had begun to disappoint him, and Evienne, whose composure was the only dowry no one had yet found a way to spend, stepped back through the servant's door and closed it behind her, with the careful smallness of a woman shutting a lid on a fire she did not intend to let out. There was no thunder. No curtain fell. In the long gallery beyond the wall, the musicians the Duke had hired for the evening began, without any awareness of what had just been decided about a wife, to tune their instruments for the second set, and the small, thin, cheerful sound of a fiddle finding its note went on as if cruelty could not exist in a house that had paid for music. She walked back to the small parlor that had been given to her 3 years earlier as her private room, and she set the ledger on the writing table, and she sat down in the chair her mother's carpenter uncle had made for her mother's own trousseau, a chair that had come with her into this marriage because no one else in Ashenfell House had wanted it. And she folded her hands in her lap and did not weep, because she had been taught, in a low farmhouse 2 counties away, that tears were water, and water belonged to the field, not to the parlor. Her mother's saying moved through her without permission, as it did in every season of difficulty, 8 words shaped like a piece of kitchen advice and carrying, inside them, the whole of a life. A woman who tends the roots owns the harvest. It had been said to her over a bowl of beans, in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and rosemary and rain drying out of wool, by a woman whose hands had been red and cracked and steady, and Evienne had not understood it then, and had not needed to. She had only needed to keep it, the way one kept a spare key in a drawer, against a day when a door might refuse to open. The door had refused to open. She sat, and she considered it. The house around her was not, in any honest ledger, the Duke's house. It had been the Duke's father's house, and before that his grandfather's, and before that a lesser lord's who had lost it at cards, but the roof over the west wing, and the new stables, and the drained south meadow that now produced hay enough to keep the county in horses through a bad winter, and the rebuilt chapel with its slate that did not leak, and the school for the tenants' children that the Duke's mother had liked to be praised for, and the 3 great tapestries in the long gallery, and the pianoforte that stood in the music room with its lid open like a mouth about to sing, and the plate on which the guests downstairs were, at this moment, being served a course of glazed pheasant, had all been bought with the money that had come into this marriage under her name. She had not brought a title. She had brought fields, 640 acres of drained bottomland, in a county the Ashenfells had never troubled to visit, a mill on a strong small river, a small brick house with a slate roof, and, in a leather box her father had carried on his knees the day the contracts were signed, coin enough in old silver and in newer paper to lift a decayed dukedom out of the mud its last 2 dukes had let it settle into. Her father had been a wool merchant with the manners of a farmer and the eye of a hawk, and he had died 3 months after the wedding with a smile on his face, because he believed he had bought his only daughter a life in which she would never again have to explain herself to anyone. He had not lived to see how thoroughly Ashenfell House explained her, every day, to itself. She was, they had agreed in the first month, useful. She read a ledger the way a bishop reads a psalter. She could look at a steward's accounts and see, in 3 minutes, which tenant had been overcharged and which underpaid, and she could speak to a housekeeper about the price of candles without the housekeeper feeling insulted. And she could write a letter to a bank in the city that made the bank answer within the week instead of within the season. And she could, when the Duke's aunt had taken to her bed with a chill and the Duke's mother had been indisposed with what she called her nerves, run a house of 40 servants for 11 days without a single dish arriving cold at table. None of this had been visible. That was the arithmetic of the house. What she did was necessary, and what was necessary was invisible, and what was invisible could not, by the laws of the drawing-room, be praised. What could be praised was Lady Corisande Verley, who at that moment was the woman laughing in the corridor. Lady Corisande was the daughter of an earl whose estates lay along the north border of Ashenfell, and she had known the Duke since they had been children who threw apples at each other from opposite sides of a low wall, and she had, in the year before Ivienne's marriage, been considered by everyone in the county to be the natural, obvious, only possible future Duchess of Ashenfell, until the Duke's father's debts had come to light and Lady Corisande's father had discovered, with a suddenness that had surprised no one who knew him, that his daughter's health required a season by the sea. She had returned from the sea a year after Ivienne's wedding, sun-browned and radiant, and full of a bright, forgiving warmth that she extended, with particular generosity, to the new Duchess, whom she called dear Ivienne in a voice that made the servants glance at each other, when they thought no one saw. She had, over the last 2 years, become, in the phrase the household used and considered witty, a great comfort to the Duke. Evienne, sitting in her mother's carpenter uncle's chair, considered the phrase. It was not, on inspection, a phrase that meant what it appeared to mean. It was, she thought, only the respectable coat that Appetite had chosen to wear. She unfolded her hands then, and she opened the ledger she had brought from the steward's room, and she wrote, in the small neat hand her father had taught her, the day's expenditures, because the running of a house did not stop for the private ruin of the woman who ran it, and she had been raised to believe that a woman who let a ledger fall behind because her heart was sore had confused her heart with the world. She wrote for an hour. When she rose, Her back ached in the particular place it ached when she had held herself too still for too long, and the fire had burned down to a red eye, and the musicians in the gallery had finished their second set and begun their third, and she went, because she had promised the housekeeper she would, down the back stairs and across the stone-flagged passage to the still room, where a maid had been set to watch a pan of quince paste that needed turning at the half hour and had, predictably, forgotten. Vivienne turned the paste, adjusted the flame, wiped a splash of syrup from the tiles with the corner of an apron that hung on a peg for that purpose, and set the pan back on its trivet at the exact heat it required. And no one saw her do it, and that too was familiar. She was climbing the back stairs again, with the quiet pride of a woman who had prevented a small disaster no one would ever know about when she heard, through the half-open door of the small yellow saloon, her sister-in-law's voice. Lady Merritt Ashenfell, the Duke's younger sister, had the kind of laugh that had been trained, in a schoolroom, to sound like water over stones. And she was using it now on a companion Vivienne could not see, and she was saying, in the tone of a woman sharing a piece of information too delicious not to share, that dear Vivienne had of course been very useful. But one could not, after all, expect the Duke to spend his whole life at a desk with a country accountant's daughter, could one? And that Corazonde, poor darling, had waited so long. And really the whole county thought it a sort of justice, and had her companion seen the necklace the Duke had ordered from the city, the one with the yellow diamonds, because it was not, whatever anyone said, a gift a man ordered for a wife. The words sounded affectionate, the pressure underneath them was not. Vivienne stood on the third step from the top of the back stairs, with her hand on the banister, and she did not move. Because she had learned, in 3 years of this house, that a woman who was overheard listening at a door was a woman who had given the room a story to tell about her, and she was not going to give this room another story. She waited until Lady Merritt's companion had made the small obligatory sound of scandalized delight, and until Lady Merritt had moved on, with the ease of a woman skating on a pond she had skated on all her life, to the subject of a hat. And then she went up the last 3 steps and along the corridor to her own room, and she closed the door, and she stood, for one breath, with her forehead against the cool painted wood. Then she straightened, because a woman who leaned on doors was a woman who was learning to lean, and she went to the small looking-glass above the washstand, and she looked at herself. She was 26 years old. Her hair was the color of wet oak, her eyes were gray, and, at this hour, tired, she was wearing the dove-colored silk her aunt had ordered made for her the month before the wedding, altered twice since to accommodate the fact that she had grown thinner in this house, and at her throat, on its plain black cord, the garnet ring rode above the neckline of the dress like a small brown eye that had refused, for 3 generations of women, to close. She lifted the ring on its cord, and she held it for a moment in her palm, and she thought of her mother's hands, which had smelled of rosemary and of the soap made from the ashes of last year's fire, and which had been warm even in winter, and which had, in a low kitchen with a black kettle on the hob, taught her the saying about roots and harvest, while a storm outside took the shingles off the barn. She put the ring back inside the neckline of the dress. She rang for her maid. She went downstairs to dinner. The dining room at Ashenfell House had been redone in the 2nd year of her marriage, in a pale green that the Duke's mother had called restful, and that Vivienne, who had paid for it, thought resembled the inside of a cold cucumber. The table seated 22, and tonight it seated 18, and she took her place at the foot of it, with the small correct smile she had learned to wear the way another woman might wear a shawl, and she inclined her head to the bishop on her right and to the colonel on her left, and she asked after the bishop's wife's rheumatism, and she listened to the colonel's opinions on the price of hay. And she agreed, with the colonel, that the price of hay was a disgrace, and she did not once look down the table to where the Duke sat with Lady Corazonde on his right and Lady Merit on his left, and where the yellow diamond necklace, whose delivery had evidently been faster than Vivienne had been led to expect, glittered against Lady Corazonde's collarbone in the light of 40 candles. It was not, whatever anyone said, a gift a man ordered for a wife. The room saw the necklace. The room decided, in the way rooms decide such things, to notice it aloud. It was Lady Merit who spoke first, in the bright, brave voice of a woman doing everyone a favor, saying how becoming yellow stones were on Corazonde, and how few women could carry them, and how they seemed almost to have been made for her throat. And Lady Corazonde lowered her lashes and said, in the tone of a woman who had prepared this modesty in a mirror, that she was quite overwhelmed and did not know how to thank the Duke for his kindness. It was not a question. The Duke, who was a tall man with a still face and a voice that never needed to rise, said only that they suited her and returned to his soup. Vivienne, at the foot of the table, cut a small piece of turbot into a smaller piece of turbot, and she considered, with the calm interest one might give a small creature crossing a polished surface, the fact that the room had just been told by a necklace what it was to be told next, and that the room had understood. The bishop, beside her, cleared his throat and asked her, with the pained gentleness of a good man who did not know what else to do, whether she had heard that the school at Marchbrook Fen had taken in 7 new pupils this term. She turned to him with her whole attention, and she said that she had heard, and that she was glad, and that the schoolmistress had written her a letter about the roof, and that the roof would hold another winter, but not 2, and the bishop, who had been braced for tears, was so relieved to be given a roof to worry about instead, that he talked about roofs for the next quarter of an hour, and Vivienne let him, and no one at the head of the table noticed that at the foot of the table a woman had turned a public humiliation into a subscription for a school. That, too, was familiar. After the ladies withdrew, she sat in the drawing-room with a cup of tea she did not drink, and she listened to Lady Corazonde play the pianoforte she herself had paid for, and she noted, without malice, that Lady Corazonde played very prettily and a little inaccurately, in the manner of a woman who had been praised for playing since she was 6, and had therefore never been corrected. And she noted also that Lady Merit, on the sofa opposite, was watching her, Vivienne, with the small, bright, watchful eyes of a person waiting to see whether a wound she had helped to open was going to bleed in a way that could be described later. Vivienne did not bleed. She drank her tea. She complimented Lady Corazonde on a passage in the Andante. She asked Lady Merit, with grave courtesy, whether the milliner had sent the pattern she had promised, and Lady Merit, who had not expected to be asked about a hat, and who was, at heart, more interested in hats than in ruin, forgot for 2 minutes to watch her. And Vivienne used those 2 minutes to breathe. It was in that breath that she felt, for the first time that evening, a thing she did not yet have a name for. It was not anger. It was not despair. It was a small, cold clarity, low and steady, like the light of a lantern set down on a floor. She examined it. She did not touch it. She let it be. When the gentlemen came in from their port, the Duke crossed the room to Lady Corazonde at the pianoforte and stood behind her chair to turn her page, and Vivienne, whose composure had by now become a kind of second dress worn over the first, rose from her seat and went, with the correct unhurried tread of a duchess who has remembered a duty, to the far end of the room, where a small side table held the evening's cards and letters. She had come, ostensibly, to look for a note the housekeeper had said would be waiting there. In fact, she had come because standing near a table gave a woman a reason to have turned her back on a room. She was reaching for the note when she realized, with the small internal jolt of a person who has been looked at across a distance, that she was being watched, and that the watcher was not Lady Merritt. At the far end of the long room, near the double doors that gave onto the gallery, stood a man she had met once before and had not expected to see again this year. Lord Cassian Varon, Marquess of Halden, cousin to the king by his mother and to the Duke of Ashenfell by his father, had arrived, apparently, sometime during the fish course and had been placed, out of respect for his rank and his notorious dislike of small talk, in the shadow between two lamps. He was leaning, in a way that in a lesser man would have looked idle and in him looked like a decision, against the frame of the doors, and he was watching her. Evienne, with the still attention of a man reading a page whose meaning he had not yet settled. He did not look away when her eyes met his. He inclined his head, very slightly, the smallest possible acknowledgement that could still be called an acknowledgement, and Evienne, who had spent 3 years being not looked at in this house, felt the acknowledgement land against her sternum like a small pebble dropped into a still well. She returned the inclination with exactly the same measure, no more, no less, and turned back to the letters. Her hand, she noticed, was perfectly steady. She had time, in the space of picking up the note and unfolding it and reading the housekeeper's neat report about a delivery of coal, to remember what she knew of him. He was said to be cold. He was said to be exacting. He was said to have refused 3 great matches in the last 5 years, and to have made, over the same period, 1 enemy at court so thoroughly that the enemy had retired to his country estates and had not returned. He was said, by those who feared him, to have eyes that saw more than a man's eyes ought to see, and, by those who admired him, to have a tongue that could cut a reputation into 2 clean pieces without ever raising itself above a murmur. He was said to be, in the private opinion of the Duke of Ashenfell, an insufferable prig. An opinion the Duke had shared with her, Evienne, once, over breakfast, in the first year of their marriage, when the Duke had still occasionally shared opinions with her over breakfast. She refolded the note. She turned. She crossed the room again, on a course that would take her past the pianoforte and past her husband, and past Lady Corisande, and past the yellow diamonds, and she did not alter her pace, and she did not lower her eyes, and she did not, when she passed within a foot of the Duke's sleeve, feel him notice her at all, because he did not. But at the far end of the room, in the shadow between 2 lamps, Lord Cassian Varon noticed that the Duke of Ashenfell had not noticed his own wife pass within a foot of his sleeve, and something in the set of the Marquise's mouth, which had been merely still, became, for 1 instant, something else, and then became still again. Evienne did not see this, because she had already reached the sofa where the bishop's wife was waiting to speak to her about the roof at Marchbrook Fen. She saw only, when she sat down and arranged her skirts, that the small cold clarity she had noticed earlier was still there, low and steady on the floor of her, like a lantern set down, and not yet picked up. By the following morning the house had rearranged itself around the necklace. It was a subtle rearrangement, and it would not have been visible to a guest, but Evienne, who had learned the house the way a good housekeeper learns a difficult clock, felt it in every room. The upper housemaid, who had for 2 years brought her chocolate at 7:30, brought it at 8 and apologized in a voice that was slightly too warm. The steward, who ordinarily waited in the small breakfast room until she came down to review the day's accounts, had not come. Lady Merritt, who ordinarily did not appear before 11, was already at the breakfast table when Evienne entered, and greeted her with a bright, sisterly kiss on the cheek that landed just short of the skin, and asked her with tender concern whether she had slept, because she looked, dear Evienne, a little pale. Evienne said that she had slept very well, "Thank you," and helped herself to toast, and asked Lady Merritt whether she intended to ride out with the party to the ruins that morning. And Lady Merritt, who had not been invited to ride out with any party, and who had believed, until this moment, that no such party existed, went a shade paler than Evienne under her rouge, and said, after the smallest pause, that she rather thought she might, if the weather held. Evienne, who had invented the party on the spot from a remark the colonel had made the night before about wanting to see the old abbey, ate her toast and said that she was sure the weather would hold, and did not smile. The Duke did not come down to breakfast. This, too, was familiar. He had breakfasted in his own rooms for a year. What was not familiar was that his valet, passing Evienne in the corridor an hour later on his way to fetch a razor, did not step aside for her, and was 3 paces past her before he remembered that he ought to have, and turned and bowed and hurried on, red to the ears. Evienne noted this. She noted the maid, and the steward's absence, and the valet, and Lady Merritt's kiss, and she went into the small parlor that had been given to her 3 years ago, and she sat down at her writing table, and she took out a fresh sheet of paper, and at the top of it, in the small neat hand her father had taught her, she wrote the day's date, and then, beneath it, a single word, underlined once. Inventory. She did not underline the word for anyone else to see. She underlined it for herself, because a woman who tended the roots owned the harvest, and because a woman who intended to know precisely what she owned had better begin, before the house began to forget, by writing it all down. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote out, from memory and from the ledgers she kept in the locked drawer of that same table, the acreage of Marchbrook Fen and of the 3 lesser farms that had come with it, and the annual yield of the mill, and the sums that had left her father's bank in the month after the wedding, and the accounts in the city into which those sums had been paid, and the names of the tradesmen whose bills had been settled out of those accounts in the years since, and the sum, to the nearest pound, that had been spent on the new stables, and on the west wing roof, and on the drained meadow, and on the chapel slate, and on the school, and on the tapestries, and on the pianoforte, and on the yellow diamond necklace whose price she had approved, without reading the description, 4 weeks ago at the request of a jeweler who had assumed, correctly, that the Duke's wife handled the Duke's household accounts. She wrote the number of the necklace at the bottom of the page, and she looked at it for a long moment, and she did not, though a lesser woman would have, cross it out. She let it stand. It was, after all, a fact. Facts, her father had said, were the only furniture worth keeping. When she had finished, she blotted the page and folded it twice, and slid it into the false bottom of the writing table, where she kept the copies of her own marriage settlement and the letter her father had written her on the morning of her wedding, and she locked the drawer, and she put the key back on the ribbon around her neck, beside the black cord that held the ring. 2 keys, she thought, and 1 heart. The saying was not her mother's. The saying was her own. She noticed that she had made it, and she noticed also that this was the second small new thing she had made in as many days, the first being the lantern of cold clarity on her interior floor, and the second this small dry sentence, and she thought that perhaps, at 26, in the 7th year of a bad decade in the country's weather, and the 3rd year of a marriage that had turned out to be a business arrangement in which one of the parties had begun to forget the terms, she was beginning, quietly, without permission, to become a woman she had not previously met. She was still considering this when there was a knock at the door, and the footman announced, in the flat voice footmen used for names they had not yet decided how to feel about, the Marquis of Halden. Evienne rose. She had not expected him. No one paid a morning call in the small parlor of the Duchess of Ashenfell. The small parlor was not a room for calls, and she was not a duchess to whom the county's great men paid calls. He came in, however, as if he had been shown into the correct room, and he stopped just inside the door, and he did not, as most men of his rank did on entering a room they had not previously been in, take stock of the furniture. He looked at her. He said, in the low, even voice she remembered from the night before, that he begged her pardon for the intrusion, that he had asked the housekeeper for the room in which the Duchess kept her accounts, that the housekeeper had directed him here, and that he would withdraw at once if he was unwelcome. She said that he was not unwelcome, because she had been taught, by a mother who had run a farm through 2 bad harvests, and a father who had bought his way into a peerage without ever raising his voice, that a woman did not turn away a marquis at her door on the morning after her husband had given another woman a necklace, because such a turning would be recorded in the house's memory. As a flinch, she indicated the chair opposite her own. He sat. He was, in the morning light that came through her small east window, less shadowed than he had been the night before, and she saw that he was perhaps 32, and that his hair was the dark brown of wet bark, and that his eyes, which she had heard called cold, were in fact gray. And gray in the particular way that gray could be when it had decided, some time ago, to give nothing away that had not been asked for. He said that he would not keep her long. He said that he had come, in fact, on a small matter of business, because the steward at his own estate at Halden had, the week before, sent him a report on the drainage works in the North Meadow that he did not entirely understand, and he had been told, by a mutual acquaintance whose name he did not trouble to give, that the Duchess of Ashenfell understood drainage as well as any man in the county, and he had wondered whether she would do him the great kindness of looking at his steward's report and telling him whether the man was competent or a fool. He said this in the tone of a man requesting a favor he did not expect to be granted, and he laid on the small table between them a folded sheaf of papers. Evienne looked at the papers. She looked at him, she said, after a pause in which she considered several answers and discarded them, that she would be glad to look at the report, and that she would send him her opinion within the week, and that she did not, she thought he should know, understand drainage as well as any man in the county, but only as well as a woman who had grown up on a farm and had learned, from the man who ran it, that a field that would not drain was a field that would not feed. He inclined his head, the same small, precise inclination he had given her the night before, and he said, in a voice that was almost but not quite dry, that in his experience the men in the county who claimed to understand drainage had, for the most part, learned it from women who had grown up on farms, and that he was therefore content with her qualification. She did not smile. She felt, however, the small internal alteration of a woman who has been spoken to, for the first time in a long time, as a person whose knowledge existed. He rose. He said that he would not detain her further. At the door, with his hand on the frame, he paused, and he said, without turning, that he had had the pleasure, the previous evening, of hearing her speak to the bishop about the roof at Marchbrook Fen, and that he had been struck by the fact that she had spoken of the roof as if she personally intended to see it mended, and that he had wondered, in passing, whether the county had any idea how fortunate it was. Then he went out, and the door closed behind him, and Evienne stood for a moment with her hand resting, without her having decided to place it there on the folded sheaf of papers he had left on her table. The papers were warm from his hand. That, she thought, was an absurd thing to notice, and she noticed it anyway. She sat down. She unfolded the report. She began, because a woman who had been asked a professional question answered the question, to read. She did not, at that moment, allow herself to consider what it meant that in the whole of the house at Ashenfell, only one man had, in 3 years, spoken to her as if her understanding were a thing that could be relied upon, and that this man was not her husband. She only read. Outside her window, the morning went on, indifferent as mornings were, and a gardener passed under the yew with a barrow, and a rook complained in the copper beech, and the great clock in the hall struck 11, and in the yellow saloon Lady Merritt told her companion, in a voice pitched to be overheard by a passing housemaid, that dear Evian had, of course, been quite dignified about the necklace, and one could almost admire her for it, if one were the sort of person who admired that sort of thing, and the housemaid, who was not paid to have opinions, went on with her dusting and formed one anyway. In the small parlor, Evian finished the first page of the report and reached for a pencil. She marked, in the margin, in her small neat hand, a single query beside a figure that did not agree with the figure 2 lines above it, and she wrote, beside the query, the words "check the fall." Then she turned the page. The lantern of cold clarity on her interior floor did not move. It only, very slightly, brightened. By the following evening, the report had been read twice and annotated in 3 colors of pencil, and Evian Marchbrook, who had been raised to believe that a promise made to a stranger was a debt owed to oneself, sat down at the writing table in her small parlor and composed her reply. She wrote to the Marquess of Halden with the correctness of a woman writing to a man she did not intend to encourage, and the precision of a woman who had discovered, in the course of an afternoon, that the steward at Halden was neither a fool nor competent, but something more interesting than either. A careful man who had been given the wrong instrument and had refused, out of professional pride, to admit that the instrument was wrong. She wrote that the fall of the North Meadow, as reported, could not produce the runoff figures the steward had returned, that if the figures were true the fall was wrong, and if the fall was true the figures were wrong, that in her experience, when a good man's arithmetic did not match his field, the field had been surveyed by a bad man, and that if the Marquess would send her the name of the surveyor she could tell him, within the day, whether the man had done similar work in her father's county, and, if so, what to do about him. She signed the letter with her married name, because she was still using it, and she sealed it with a plain wafer, because she did not wish to seal a letter to a marquis with the Ashenfell arms while the Ashenfell arms were, at that moment, being embroidered onto a pair of yellow silk gloves for Lady Corisande. She sent it by the 2nd post. The reply came by the 1st post of the following morning, in an envelope addressed in a hand she had not seen before, upright and unshowy and cut off at the ends as if the writer had refused, on principle, to let his pen flourish. The letter inside was 3 lines long. It gave her the surveyor's name. It thanked her for her time. It said that he would be grateful, at her convenience, for a further quarter of an hour of her attention on a related matter, and that he would present himself at whatever hour she named. She named 11. He came at 11. It became, over the fortnight that followed, a small quiet fact of the house that the Marquess of Halden, who had been visiting his cousin at Ashenfell for what was ostensibly a shooting party, could be found 3 mornings a week between 11 and past in the small parlor of the Duchess, discussing drainage. The house did not, at first, know what to do with this fact. The steward, who had reappeared on the 2nd morning with the air of a man remembering an appointment, glanced at the closed parlor door with the same expression he had worn at the account of the yellow diamonds, and then, being a man of a certain age and a certain temper, decided that he had not seen the door, and went on with his day. The upper housemaid, who brought the chocolate now at 7:30 again, and had begun to bring it with a small warm scone that had not been on the tray the week before, kept her opinions inside her apron. Lady Merritt tried, on the fourth morning, to arrange to be walking past the parlor at 11, and discovered, to her irritation, that the corridor which passed the parlor was very cold at that hour, and that the Marquess, when he crossed her path, bowed with such exact civility that there was no purchase in it for any conversation whatsoever, and she went away with the dissatisfied air of a woman who had gone fishing in a pond she had been assured was full, and had caught nothing but her own hook. Lady Corisande was cleverer. She did not walk past the parlor. She did not mention the parlor. She instead began, on the fifth morning, to appear at breakfast in a new arrangement of hair that she said had been suggested to her by a French book, and to speak, over the toast, about the great pleasure it gave her to see the Marquess taking such an interest in the improvements at Halden. Because everyone knew, did they not, that Halden was a very fine estate that only wanted a wife to complete it, and one had heard, of course, only rumors, but one had heard that the Marquise had begun at last to look about him in earnest. She said this to the room, and not to Evian, but she did not look at the Duke when she said it, and the Duke did not look at her, and Evian, who was buttering a piece of toast in the manner of a woman who had once seen a picture of a woman buttering toast and had decided to reproduce it, understood that a story had begun to be told about her downstairs, and that the story would, in the way of such stories, get louder before it got quieter. She buttered her toast. She asked the bishop, who had stayed on for the shooting, whether he had ridden yet to the ruins. The bishop said he had, and the ruins were much as ruins ordinarily were, and Evian said that this was reassuring in an age of change, and the bishop laughed the surprised bark of a good man who had not expected wit at breakfast, and the moment moved on. Lord Cassian, when he came at 11 that morning, glanced at her once as he took his chair, and she saw in his face, for the length of a single unhurried breath, that he had heard the story too, and that he was not going to speak of it, and that this refusal to speak of it was, in him, the closest thing to a raised standard that she was likely to see. They discussed the surveyor. He had, as she had suspected, done similar work in her father's county, and had been dismissed from it, and had turned up at Halden under a slightly altered name. Lord Cassian said that he would deal with the surveyor. He said it without emphasis, in the same voice in which he had asked her, the week before, whether he might send a servant round for a further page of her notes, and Evian, who had grown up among men who dealt with things, and had learned to distinguish the dealing that was performed for audiences from the dealing that was simply done, understood that the surveyor was already, in effect, dealt with. She noted this. She noted also that she had begun, without permission, to look forward to 11 o'clock on the mornings he was expected, and she made herself examine the noting, and she found, at the bottom of it, not the fluttering foolishness she had been taught by 100 novels to fear, but a small steady pleasure that felt uncomfortably like being seen. And she put the pleasure aside, because a woman who did not know what her own pleasures cost her was a woman who would eventually be sold one at a price she could not pay. She rose, when the quarter hour had passed, to indicate that his time was up, and he rose also, and at the door he turned, as he had turned the first day, and he said, without preamble, that he had been thinking about the roof at Marchbrook Fen. She did not answer at once. He said that his own steward had, some years ago, mended a similar roof at a similar cost, and that he could, if she wished, send her the accounts and the name of the man who had done the work. She said that she would be grateful. He said that he had not, in offering, intended any presumption. She said that she had not, in accepting, felt any. He inclined his head. He went out. She stood for a moment at the closed door, and she thought that in 3 years no one in this house had ever asked her whether an offer they made her presumed. She sat down. She wrote a note to the schoolmistress at Marchbrook Fen. She said in the note that the roof would be mended in the spring and that the schoolmistress was not to worry, and she signed the note with the small neat hand her father had taught her, and she blotted it, and she folded it, and she sealed it with the plain wafer, and she thought, with a small internal shock she did not permit to reach her face, that she had used the word mended in the future, indicative, and not in the conditional, and that this was a small grammar, and it was also, somewhere under the small grammar, an oath. That evening at dinner, the Duke of Ashenfell, who had not for a fortnight addressed a remark to his wife across the length of the table, addressed one. He asked her, in the pleasant flat voice he used for stewards and horses, whether she had enjoyed her morning. It was not a question. The room heard it as not a question. Lady Corisande, on his right, lowered her lashes and picked up her wineglass. Lady Merritt, on his left, held her breath in the manner of a woman who had been waiting a fortnight for a particular door to open and had heard, at last, the latch lift. Evienne, at the foot of the table, lifted her eyes to her husband's, and she said, in the voice she used for the bishop's wife and for the tenant farmers, and for the small children who were brought up from the village on rent days to be introduced to the Duchess and to have their heads patted, that she had, thank you, enjoyed her morning very much. That she had spent it in useful conversation about drainage, and that she was glad to hear that he took an interest in how she employed her hours. She said the word useful with the same weight the Duke had used in the corridor, and she did not look away when she said it, and the Duke, who had not expected the weight, blinked once, very slightly, before he recovered his face. The room caught the weight. The bishop, who had begun, over the fortnight, to develop a mild, worried affection for the Duchess, coughed into his napkin. The colonel, who was deaf in one ear and not in the other, understood that something had passed and, being a soldier, decided that the safest response was to ask for the salt. Lady Merritt, who understood best of all, went a shade paler under her rouge and reached for her water. Lord Cassian, who had been placed, out of respect for his rank and his notorious dislike of small talk, halfway down the table on Evienne's side, did not move. He did not turn his head. He did not lift his wineglass. He only, with the smallest possible motion of his hand, set down the piece of bread he had been about to break and left it uneaten on his plate, and Evienne, who did not see him do this, felt nevertheless the still attention along her right side altar, as if a lamp 2 rooms away had been lit. The Duke, recovering, said that he was glad to hear it. He said that he supposed one had to fill one's mornings. He said, with a small pale smile that did not reach the still face, that a woman of her practical turn no doubt found drainage a natural subject. Lady Corisande laughed the short, bright laugh Evienne had first heard in the corridor. Evienne, at the foot of the table, cut a piece of pheasant into a smaller piece of pheasant. She said, in the tone of a woman helpfully agreeing, that she found drainage a very natural subject. Because a field that would not drain was a field that would not feed, and that in her father's county it had been considered, among practical people, to be the foundation of every other good thing, and that she had been raised to believe that a house built on a field that would not drain was a house that would, in time, come down. She did not look at the West Wing when she said this. She did not need to. The room, which had, in the course of the fortnight, learned to hear her, heard the West Wing anyway. The bishop coughed again. The colonel, thwarted in his salt, asked for the pepper. Lady Corisande's laugh did not repeat. Lord Cassian, halfway down the table, at last picked up his bread and broke it, and the small dry sound of the crust parting under his fingers was, to Evienne, the loudest sound in the room. That night, after the ladies had withdrawn and Lady Corisande had played, less prettily than usual, at the pianoforte, and after Evienne had drunk a cup of tea she did not drink, and complimented a passage in the Andante that had in fact been rushed, she was crossing the hall to the staircase when the housekeeper, Mrs. Enderby, stepped out of the shadow of the tall clock and asked her, in a low, steady voice, whether her grace could spare a moment. Mrs. Enderby had been at Ashenfell House for 31 years. She had, in her time, run the household for the old Duke and for the old Duke's mother, and for the young Duke's mother, and she had, in the 3 years of Evienne's marriage, arrived at the private opinion that the young Duchess was the first mistress of the house since the young Duke's grandmother, who had understood that a house did not run on charm. She did not, in general, speak to Evienne of the household above the ordinary business. She spoke to her tonight. She said, in the low, steady voice she used when she was about to place a hot dish on a cold table, that a letter had come that afternoon for the Duke, in a hand she had not seen before, from the city, and that the Duke had read it in his study and had, an hour later, sent for the Ashenfell family solicitor, who had not been called to the house in 18 months, that the solicitor had come. That the two of them had shut themselves into the study for 2 hours, that the fire had been built up twice, that the solicitor had left with a leather case under his arm, and that the Duke, on returning to the drawing-room, had asked whether the Duchess had already gone up, and had been told that she had not, and had said, with the pleasant flat voice he used for stewards, that in that case he would go up himself. Mrs. Enderby paused. She said that she did not, of course, know what the letter had contained. She said that she thought her grace should know that the letter had arrived. Evienne stood in the shadow of the tall clock and considered the housekeeper. She said, after a small pause, that she was grateful. She said that Mrs. Enderby was very kind. She said, because the housekeeper had waited 31 years to be spoken to as an equal by a woman of the family, and had not, in 3 years, asked for it, that she was fortunate to have Mrs. Enderby in the house. Mrs. Enderby, whose composure was even better than Evienne's because it had been trained for longer, inclined her head the exact fraction of an inch that a housekeeper was permitted to incline her head to a duchess, and stepped back into the shadow of the clock, and Evienne went up the stairs, and along the corridor, and into her own room, and she closed the door behind her, and she sat down at the small dressing table, and she looked at herself in the glass, and she said, aloud, in a voice that surprised her by being level, "Well then." She sat for a long while. She did not ring for her maid. She unpinned her own hair. She laid the pins in a row on the dressing table. She looked in the glass at the ring on its black cord against the collar of her nightgown, and she thought of her mother in the low kitchen with the black kettle, and she said, again aloud, "We tend the roots, we own the harvest," and the small dry statement, spoken to no one but the ring, steadied her more than any prayer she had ever been given by a bishop. In the morning she did not wait to be sent for. She went, at 9:30, to the Duke's study. And she knocked, and she went in without waiting to be answered, because a woman who waited to be answered at her own husband's study door was a woman who had already accepted a reduction in her rank, and she had reduced enough. The Duke was at his desk. The solicitor's leather case was not on the desk, but there was, in the middle of the blotter, a folded document tied with green tape, and Evienne, who had learned over 3 years the shape and color of every document that crossed her husband's blotter, saw at once that this was not a document she had seen before. She sat down opposite him without being asked. She said, "Good morning." She said that Mrs. Enderby had told her that a letter had come. She said that she assumed the letter and the document were connected. She said that she would be glad, if he cared to explain them to her, to hear the explanation. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. His still face, which had been still for the length of their marriage, was slightly less still than she had ever seen it, and she understood, with the small, cold clarity of the lantern on her interior floor, that he was afraid, and that he was not afraid of her, but that he was afraid of a thing he had already begun to do and did not yet know how to finish. He said, at last, that she had always been a practical woman. He said, in the pleasant, flat voice, that he would therefore be practical with her. He said that certain irregularities had come to light. He said that a paper had reached him from the city concerning her father's business dealings in the year before her marriage. He said that the paper alleged, with what he was assured was documentary support, that her father, in raising the sums that had come with her into this marriage, had, in one particular transaction, obtained monies from a certain merchant house on a security that he had not, at the time, been entitled to offer, and that the merchant house had, by extension, a claim on those sums, and, by further extension, on any property purchased with those sums, and that the settlement between them, which had been drawn on the assumption that the sums had been her father's to give, was therefore at law imperfectly founded. He said that this was, of course, a matter of the greatest delicacy. He said that he had no wish to distress her. He said that he had, on the advice of the family solicitor, thought it wise to take certain precautions, in the interest of the family, until the matter was cleared. He said that among those precautions was a document, drawn overnight, which he had here on the blotter, by which she would consent to the temporary management of the disputed properties by trustees named by him, so that no imprudent action on her part could complicate the position. He said that if she would sign the document, he could give her his word as a gentleman that the matter would be handled discreetly, and that her father's name, which he understood she valued, would not appear in any court. He did not once look at the ring at her throat. Evienne looked at the document. She did not touch it. She said, in the voice she used for the bishop's wife, that she was grateful for his frankness. She said that she would like, if he had no objection, to see the paper from the city. The Duke said that the paper was, unfortunately, of a confidential nature. She said that she understood, and that she would nevertheless like to see it. The Duke said that the solicitor had taken it away. She said, in the same tone, that in that case she would be glad if the solicitor might be asked to bring it back, because a woman was ordinarily permitted, before signing away the management of her father's property, to read the paper that alleged her father had stolen it. The Duke, whose still face had been trained by generations of dukes to remain still under the small impertinences of tradesmen and tenants and wives, remained still. He said that the paper was very delicate. He said that he did not wish her to be pained. He said that he would consider, in the course of the day, whether the paper could be produced, and that in the meantime he must ask her not to correspond with any party on the subject, because such correspondence could be construed. She rose. She said that she would not then sign the document today. She said that she would await the paper. She said, at the door, in the same voice she had used the evening before at the foot of the table, that a house built on a field that would not drain was a house that would in time come down, that she was grateful for his concern for her father's name, and that she trusted his concern would not, in the interim, prevent her from seeing the evidence. She went out. She did not slam the door. She did not need to. She walked back along the corridor to her own parlor with the correct, unhurried tread, and she went in, and she closed the door, and she went to the writing table, and she took out the letter that had come from her father's bank 2 years ago, acknowledging the last of the transfers, and she took out the copy of her marriage settlement, and she took out a fresh sheet of paper, and she began, with the small, neat hand her father had taught her, to write. She wrote first to Mr. Halberd, her father's man of business in the city, who had been the second signatory on every transaction her father had ever conducted, and who had, at her father's funeral, taken both her hands in his, and told her that if she ever needed him, she was to write in her own hand and not through any solicitor, because the ink would tell him it was truly her. She wrote to him now in her own hand. She wrote briefly. She said that a paper had reached the Duke of Ashenfell alleging an irregularity in the raising of her dowry, that the paper had not been shown to her, that she required, by return, a full accounting of every transaction her father had made in the 6 months before her marriage, together with copies of every signature and every security offered, and that if any transaction had, in fact, been irregular, she wished to know it before her husband did, because she would rather learn a bad truth from a friend than a convenient truth from a stranger. She sealed the letter with the plain wafer. She wrote next to her uncle, her mother's elder brother, Sir Ambrose Trenholm, who lived at 73 in a small stone house at the edge of the county where her mother had been born, and who had, since the day of her marriage, said very little to her that was not either a piece of blunt farming advice or a warning against the pretensions of dukes. She wrote him 3 lines. She said that she was in a small difficulty. She said that she did not yet know its shape. She said that she would be grateful if he would come. She sealed that letter too. She rang for the footman. She sent both by the noon post, and she watched, through the window of the parlor, the boy go down the drive with them on the cob, and she said aloud, "To the empty room, we tend the roots." Then she sat down, and, because a woman who tended the roots did not sit down to weep, she opened the household ledger and she wrote the day's expenditures, and she noted, in the margin beside the entry for the necklace, in the smallest hand she could manage, a single mark that meant, in the private code her father had used and taught her, to be recovered. Mr. Halbert's answer came in 4 days. Sir Ambrose's answer came in 3, in the form of the man himself, arriving in a mud-spattered gig at the front door of Ashenfell House at 3:30 in the afternoon, without having sent a card, in the tweed of a country baronet who had never in his life pretended to be anything else, and demanding, in the voice he used for market days, to see his niece. Mrs. Enderby, who had known Sir Ambrose since he had been a young man, and she a young housemaid, at a house he had visited, was in the hall before the footman, and had him inside and out of his greatcoat, and into the small library on the ground floor, with a fire built up, and a decanter on the table, before the Duke, who had been informed of the arrival, had finished settling his stock in the glass upstairs. Vivienne went down. Her uncle rose from the fire when she came in, and he looked at her, once, with the pale blue eyes that had been her mother's brother's before they had been his, and he said, in a voice that had no gentleness in it and all the tenderness in the world, "Girl, sit down." She sat. He said, "Tell me." She told him briefly, because he had always preferred brevity, and she told him accurately, because he had always been able to tell when she padded a report, and she did not, in telling him, apologize for anything. Because he had raised her mother, and her mother had raised her, and neither of them had believed in the apology as an opening move. When she had finished, he sat for a moment looking at the fire. He said, at last, without turning his head, "And I suppose he has offered you a paper to sign." She said that he had. He said, "And I suppose he has not shown you the letter from the city." She said that he had not. He said, "And I suppose the solicitor took it away." She said that the solicitor had. He said, well, he said that he had known her father for 30 years, and that her father had, in that time, done many hard things, and 1 or 2 sharp ones, and that in every one of them he had left a paper trail as clean as a swept floor. Because a man who lived by ledgers did not survive dirty ledgers, and that if there was a real irregularity in the raising of her dowry, Mrs. Talbert would have known it before her father had, and would have written to her about it within an hour of her father's death. He said that he would wager the small stone house at the edge of the county on Mr. Halbert's answer. He said, "Therefore, we wait for the post." He said, "In the meantime, girl, and this is the important thing, do not sign." She said that she had not, and would not. He said, "Good," he said. "And one more thing." He said that in his experience, a man who came at a woman with a paper about her dead father's honor was a man who had already decided to be rid of her, and that the paper was not the cause of the being rid of, but the excuse for it, and that she was not, on any account, to allow herself to argue about the paper as if the paper were the point. He said, "The point is that he wants your fields." He said, "And if he wants your fields, then your fields are the point." He said, "Do you understand me?" She said that she did. He said, "Good girl," he said. "Now go and order me some tea, because I have been 3 days on the road and I am too old for it, and let me sit by this fire and be a nuisance to your husband for a week." She went. She ordered the tea. She went, before she returned to the library, into her small parlor, and she sat down at the writing table, and she took out the folded sheet of paper on which she had written, 3 weeks earlier, the word inventory, and she wrote beneath the last line, in the same small neat hand, a second word, and she underlined it once. Defense, Mr. Halbert's answer arrived the following morning. It was a package. It was tied in the same green tape that had bound the document on the Duke's blotter, but the hand that had tied it was the shaky, careful hand of a man in his 60s who had spent his life tying such packages, and Evienne knew the knot at once. She took the package into the library where Sir Ambrose was sitting with his boots off and his stockinged feet on the fender, and she cut the tape, and they read the letter together. Mr. Halbert had, as her father had trained him to, gone at once to the transaction the Duke's paper had alleged. He had found the ledgers. He had found the correspondence. He had found the security that had been offered, which was a piece of land at the edge of a small mill town, and he had found the deed by which her father had come into that land, and he had found the release from the previous holder, and he had found the receipt for the stamp duty, and he had found the countersignature of the merchant house on the acceptance of the security, and he had found, most importantly, the date. The date on which the security had been offered was the 9th of April. The date on which the merchant house had accepted it was the 11th. The paper the Duke's solicitor had shown to the Duke, of which Mr. Halbert had, by means he did not describe in the letter and Evienne did not ask about, obtained a fair copy, alleged that the security had been offered on the 23rd of March, 3 weeks earlier, at a time when, the paper further alleged, her father had not yet in fact acquired the land. This was the anomaly on which the whole accusation was built. If her father had offered as security a piece of land he had not yet owned, the transaction was fraudulent, and every sum raised on it, and every property purchased with those sums, was tainted at law. If, on the other hand, he had offered it on the 9th of April, when he had held the deed for a full week, the transaction was clean, and the paper was a forgery. Mr. Halbert had enclosed with his letter, in a smaller envelope, 3 items. The first was a certified copy of the deed, dated the 2nd of April, and stamped. The second was a copy of the receipt from the merchant house, dated the 11th and countersigned. The third was a small square of paper on which Mr. Halbert had, in his own hand, copied out the passage from the Duke's paper in which the 23rd of March appeared, and had underlined the date twice, and had written beside it, in the margin, 3 words, "This is wrong." Sir Ambrose looked at the 3 items. He looked at the fire. He said, without heat, "Well, there it is." He said that in his experience, a forger who could not get his dates right could not be trusted to boil an egg, and that the forger of this paper had made the mistake of choosing a date that fell in a month during which her father had, as it happened, kept a journal, because her father had spent the last week of March in a mill town Sir Ambrose could name, on a matter Sir Ambrose could describe, in the company of 2 men Sir Ambrose could produce, and that the journal was in his own writing desk at the small stone house at the edge of the county, and that if it came to it, he would travel back and fetch it himself, and that in the meantime the deed and the receipt were sufficient to expose the paper for what it was, and to expose, by extension, the man who had commissioned it. If a man had commissioned it, or the woman, if a woman had. He said, "Do you know, girl, whether the paper came into this house alone?" Evian said that Mrs. Enderby had told her that a letter had come that afternoon in an unfamiliar hand from the city, and that the Duke had read it in his study and had, an hour later, sent for the solicitor. Sir Ambrose said, "Well, that is one letter," he said. "Has your husband, to your knowledge, corresponded with anyone in the city on this matter without the solicitor's knowledge?" Evian said that she did not know. He said, "Has anyone in this house corresponded with anyone in the city in the last month on any matter?" Evian considered. She said that Lady Corisande had 3 weeks before sent a package to the city, addressed in her own hand, and had been very particular that it be sent by the same afternoon's post, and had asked the footman to bring her the receipt, and had been unusually pleasant to the footman when he did, and that the footman, whose name was Peter and who had been in the house since he was 12, had mentioned it to Mrs. Enderby, who had mentioned it, without seeming to Evian, in the course of a conversation about linens. Sir Ambrose looked at her. He said, "Girl, does the great lady, in your considered opinion, correspond on her own account with a house of business in the city?" Evian said that in her considered opinion, the great lady did not know a house of business from a bakery. Sir Ambrose said, "Well, then," he said, "we shall not, at this stage, name her." He said, "We do not need to." He said, "We need only to show your husband the deed and the receipt, and to invite him, in the presence of a witness, to compare the date on his paper with the date on the deed, and to observe, with him, whether the paper survives the comparison." He said, "And if the paper does not survive the comparison, then we shall let him decide, in his own conscience, whom he wishes to protect." He said, "That is not our business." He said, "Our business is to keep your fields." He said, "Ring for a footman." She rang. She said to the footman, whose name was Peter, and who had been in the house since he was 12, that she would be grateful if he would ask the Duke to attend her in the small library, at the Duke's convenience, and would bring, when he came, the folded document that had been on the blotter of the desk in the study, and would ask the Duke's solicitor, if the Duke's solicitor were in the house, to attend also, and that Sir Ambrose Trenholm would be present. Peter, who had known Sir Ambrose since Sir Ambrose had first come to the house at her wedding, and had, on that occasion, tipped him a shilling and told him not to spend it on nonsense, understood the shape of what was being asked of him, and inclined his head and went. Evian said, "Uncle, one thing." He said, "Yes," she said. "Will you object if I ask Lord Halden to be present?" Sir Ambrose looked at her for a long moment over the top of his spectacles. He said, at last, "And who, girl, is Lord Halden?" She said that he was the Marquis of Halden, cousin to the king, and that he was, at present, a guest in the house, and that he had, over the past month, done her the courtesy of consulting her about a matter of drainage on his own estate, and that in doing so he had spoken to her as if her understanding were a thing that could be relied upon, and that she trusted his discretion, and that she would prefer, in a matter that concerned the honor of her father, to have in the room a man who had not, in 3 years, mistaken her competence for a threat. Sir Ambrose considered her. He said, "At last, and does Lord Halden know that he is about to be entrusted with your father's honor?" She said that he did not. She said that she was going, if her uncle would permit her, to trust him with it without asking his permission first, because she had discovered, in the course of the fortnight, that a woman who asked a man's permission to trust him was a woman who had already surrendered the trust. Sir Ambrose said, "Girl," he said, "you are your mother's daughter." He said, "Ring again." She rang. She wrote a note in the small, neat hand. She said in it that a matter of some delicacy touching the estate of her late father was to be discussed in the small library within the half-hour, in the presence of her uncle Sir Ambrose Trenholm, and the Duke of Ashenfell, and the Duke's solicitor, and that she would be grateful, if it were not an imposition, for the Marquess's attendance as a disinterested witness. She sealed the note. She gave it to Peter. She said, "Take this to Lord Halden, and wait for his answer." Peter went. He returned within 4 minutes. He said, "His lordship's compliments, and he will attend her grace at once." He had also, Peter added, sent his own man to the study to walk beside the Duke's man in bringing the folded document, so that neither man could be in the corridor alone. Peter did not smile when he said this, because Peter had been trained not to smile at such moments, but Evienne saw the small movement at the corner of his mouth, and she understood that Peter, who had been in the house since he was 12, had understood and was on her side, and had, in his own quiet way, just declared it. She sat down beside the fire. Sir Ambrose put his boots back on. The door opened. Lord Cassian Varon came in first, without being announced, and he crossed the room to her, and he bowed the small precise bow she had come to recognize as his particular mark of attention, and he said, in the low, even voice, "Madame, whatever is required." She said, "Thank you." She did not say more. She did not need to. The Duke arrived a minute later with his solicitor and with the document, and he did not look at her at once, and when he did look at her and saw who else was in the room, his still face became, for one instant, so entirely still that Evienne understood, with the small, cold clarity of the lantern on her interior floor, that he had not expected to face his wife on this matter with a witness of Lord Cassian's rank in the room, and that he had, in that instant, begun to calculate what a man in his position might yet salvage from what a man in his position had begun. Sir Ambrose rose. He said, "Good morning." He said, "Sit down, Ashenfell, and let us look at your paper." The Duke sat. The solicitor, who was a thin, dry man who had grown up under the old Duke and had feared him, and had, in the course of his career, become the kind of man who could be frightened by the wrong deed being produced at the right hour, laid the document on the table and untied the green tape. Sir Ambrose laid, beside it, the deed and the receipt from Mr. Halbert's package. He laid, beside those, the small square of paper on which Mr. Halbert had written 3 words. Lord Cassian, without being invited to, drew his chair up to the table opposite Evienne, so that any paper on the table lay between them and could be read by both of them at once, and he did not, in doing so, take his eyes from the Duke's face. Evienne said, in the voice she used for the bishop's wife, "Would you be so good as to read the passage in which the date appears?" The solicitor cleared his throat. He read the passage. He read the date. He read the 23rd of March. Sir Ambrose picked up the certified deed. He read, in the voice he used for market days, the date. He read the 2nd of April. He picked up the receipt from the merchant house. He read the 11th. He set both down. He looked at the Duke. He said, "Ashenfell," he said, "your paper says the 23rd of March." He said, "The deed says the 2nd of April." He said, "The receipt says the 11th." He said, On the 23rd of March, my brother-in-law was in a mill town 2 counties from the security named in your paper. On business I can describe, and with witnesses I can produce. And he had not yet acquired the security, because the security was acquired on the 2nd of April, as the deed shows, in the presence of the solicitor whose seal is on the corner. He said, "Your paper is wrong." He said, "Ashenfell, there it is." The Duke did not answer. He looked at the deed. He looked at the receipt. He looked at his own paper. He did not once look at his wife. The solicitor, who had spent 30 years in the service of dukes and had learned, in that service, the small movements by which a man about to fall could be assisted or refused, cleared his throat again and said, in a voice that had shed several years in the last 2 minutes, that if his grace would permit him, he would like to withdraw the paper from consideration, pending further inquiry. Sir Ambrose said, "No," he said, "Ashenfell, the paper does not go back to the city." He said, "The paper stays in this room until we know who wrote it." He said, "And you, Ashenfell, are going to help us find out." The Duke, at last, looked at his wife. He looked at her for a long moment. His still face was, for the first time in 3 years, not quite still, and Evienne saw in it something she had not seen there before, and she understood, without wishing to understand, that what she was seeing was shame, and that shame, in a man who had been trained to be still, moved slowly, and that it was moving now. He said, at last, in the pleasant flat voice, that this was a most unfortunate matter, and that he had of course been imposed upon, and that he would take steps at once to discover the impostor, and that he begged his wife's pardon for having, in the interest of the family, entertained the paper at all. He said the word wife with visible effort. He did not, in saying it, look at Lord Cassian. Sir Ambrose said, "Ashenfell," he said, "you will apologize to her in a form we can all hear, and you will withdraw the document you laid on her table, and you will give me your word, before this witness, that you will not attempt to place any other such document before her without my knowledge, and you will begin, this afternoon, to discover the impostor. And you will report your discovery to this room within the week." He said, "Is that agreed?" The Duke, whose still face had by now recovered, said that it was agreed. He apologized. The apology was correct in its form and empty in its substance, and every person in the room, including the Duke, knew it, and no person in the room, including Evienne, expected otherwise, because an apology forced out of a man who had already begun to be rid of a wife was not an apology at all, but a receipt for a debt he had not yet decided to pay. She accepted it in the voice she used for the bishop's wife. She said that she was grateful for his frankness. She said that she trusted the impostor would be discovered. She did not, when she said this, look at the ceiling above them, beyond which, in the yellow saloon, Lady Corisande was, at that hour, playing on the pianoforte the same passage in the Andante she had rushed the night before. She did not need to. Lord Cassian looked at the ceiling. He looked at it for the length of one small dry breath. Then he looked back at Evienne, and in his gray eyes she saw, for the first time, something that was not the still attention of a man reading a page whose meaning he had not yet settled, but the settled attention of a man who had, at last, read to the end. The Duke rose. The solicitor gathered the papers, and the deed, and the receipt, and, at Sir Ambrose's nod, left the deed and the receipt on the table with Sir Ambrose, and took only the discredited paper away in his case, and he and the Duke went out together. The door closed behind them. Sir Ambrose sat down again by the fire. He said, "Girl, well done." He said, "Now go and rest, because the next part is the harder one." She said, "Uncle," she said. "Thank you." He said, "Do not thank me, girl." He said, "Thank your mother." He said, "We tend the roots." She said, "We own the harvest." He closed his eyes. Lord Cassian rose. He said at the door that he would not, if she would permit him, leave the house today, and that he would be, if she required him, in the long gallery until the dressing bell. He said this without emphasis, in the low, even voice, and Evian, who understood by now the exact weight of anything he did without emphasis, understood that he had just, in the presence of her uncle, promised her a bodyguard, and that he had done so without asking her permission, because he had learned, in the course of the fortnight, that a man who asked a woman's permission to defend her was a man who had already surrendered the defense. She said, in the same voice, that she was grateful. He inclined his head. He went out. Sir Ambrose, without opening his eyes, said, "Girl," he said, "that man." Evian said, "Uncle." Sir Ambrose said nothing more. He did not need to. Outside the window of the small library the afternoon went on, indifferent as afternoons were, and a rook complained in the copper beech, and Peter crossed the yard with a bucket, and somewhere in the west wing a housemaid, who had heard from the under-butler, who had heard from Mrs. Enderby, that a paper had been laid on the Duchess's table and had not survived Sir Ambrose Trenholm, went about her dusting with the small private satisfaction of a woman who had, without being asked, formed an opinion, and Evian, sitting by the fire beside her uncle, felt at last the small cold clarity on her interior floor lift itself, deliberately, from the boards, and take, for the first time in 3 years, the shape of a lantern that a woman might, if she chose, pick up and carry with her into a room she had not yet entered. That evening at dinner, the Duke did not address a remark to his wife across the length of the table, and Lady Corisande did not laugh her short, bright laugh, and Lady Merritt did not kiss her sister-in-law's cheek, and the bishop, who had understood nothing and sensed everything, spoke at length about the school at Marchbrook Fen, and the colonel asked for the salt without being thwarted. And Lord Cassian, halfway down the table on Evian's side, ate his bread. When the ladies withdrew, Lady Corisande did not play. She said, with a small, bright complaint about a headache, that she would go up. She went up. Lady Merritt, deprived of her instrument, sat by the fire and said very little. Evian drank her tea. When the gentlemen came in from their port, Sir Ambrose was among them, having invited himself to the decanter, and he crossed the room to Evian, and he sat down beside her, and he said, in the voice he used for market days but pitched, this once, for her ear only, "Girl, the wind is turning." He said, "Tomorrow it will blow." He said, "Be ready." She said that she would. She was still saying it when the double doors at the far end of the room opened, and Peter, who had been posted there since 7, stepped inside and murmured to Mrs. Enderby, who had come to stand beside him, and Mrs. Enderby crossed the room to Evian with the correct, unhurried tread of a housekeeper who had a message it was proper to deliver in person, and she bent, and she said, low, that her grace was wanted, if she could spare the moment, in the small library, alone, and that his lordship, the Marquess of Halden, was waiting there, and that he had asked her, Mrs. Enderby, to say to the Duchess only that a matter had come to his attention within the last quarter of an hour concerning her father's name, and that he would not, on any account, act on it without her knowledge, but that he could not, in conscience, wait until morning. Evian set down her cup. She rose. Sir Ambrose looked at her once, and did not speak. The rain, which had been threatening since dusk, began, with a small definite tap against the long windows, to fall. She crossed the drawing room with the correct, unhurried tread of a duchess who had been sent for on a household matter, and she went out into the corridor, and the sound of the rain against the long windows followed her along the passage the way a small dog follows a woman who has been kind to it, and Mrs. Enderby walked a pace behind her with a candle that did not need to be carried because the wall sconces were still lit, and Evian understood that Mrs. Enderby was carrying the candle because Mrs. Enderby had decided, on her own authority, to put a witness at the door of the small library while a matter was inside it, and Evian did not turn to thank her, because a woman who thanked a housekeeper for a candle in a corridor turned the candle into a statement, and the candle was more useful as a candle. At the door, Mrs. Enderby set the candle in the bracket that stood empty beside the frame, and she said, in the low, steady voice, that she would be in the still room at the end of the passage until her grace came out, and that no one would enter the corridor from either end without passing her, and Evian said that she was grateful, and she went in and she closed the door behind her. Lord Cassian Varon was standing at the far side of the fire. He did not, when she came in, cross to her. He stood where he was, at the outer edge of the hearthrug, with his hands loose at his sides, and the small folded paper he had been holding still folded, and Evian understood, before he had spoken, that he had placed himself deliberately at that distance, and that the distance was the first thing he intended to say to her. The fire had been built up. The long red curtains had been drawn against the rain. The room, which by day had been the room in which her father's honor had been restored, had by candlelight and firelight and the small sustained percussion of the storm on the window become another room. And Evian, who had learned in the fortnight to notice which rooms had been rearranged around her without her permission, noticed that this room had been rearranged, and noticed also that it had been rearranged by the weather and not by any person in the house, and this steadied her more than she had expected. She stopped inside the door. She said, in the voice she used for the bishop's wife, my lord. He said, Madam. He said that he begged her pardon for the hour. He said that he would not have sent for her if the matter would have kept until morning, and that he had considered in the quarter of an hour before he had asked Mrs. Enderby to fetch her whether it would keep, and that he had concluded, on his honor, that it would not. He said that he had, in the course of the afternoon, made certain inquiries through his own man, who had been sent, some days earlier and without her knowledge, to the city, on the pretext of a matter concerning his own affairs, that the man had returned within the hour, that the man had brought back the name of the writing master in whose upright, unshowy hand the letter to the Duke had been drafted, that the writing master, on being pressed, had named the party who had commissioned the letter, and that the party so named was not the great lady upstairs, whom he had suspected, but a person a good deal cleverer, who had used the great lady as her post office, and who had, in doing so, left, as clever people occasionally did, one signature on a receipt for a fee that the writing master had, out of professional habit, kept. He laid the folded paper on the small table between them. He said that he would not, without her leave, open it in this room, because the name inside it belonged, in the first instance, to her, and that she should be the first person in this house to read it, and that she should decide, before any other person did, what use was to be made of it. He said, in the same low, even voice, that he had wished her to know, before she read the name, that he had not undertaken the inquiry in order to earn her gratitude. He said that he had undertaken it because a woman under his cousin's roof had been offered a forged paper about her dead father, and no man of any conscience who had happened to be under the same roof could have failed to undertake it, and that he did not wish her to mistake the ordinary act of a decent man for anything larger than it was. He said this the way a man laid down a stone he did not intend to pick up again. Evienne looked at the paper on the table. She did not touch it. She said, "My lord," she said, "will you sit down?" He sat. She sat. She said, in the voice she used for the bishop's wife but pitched, for the first time in the fortnight, half a shade lower, that she was grateful for his care and for his discretion, and that she would read the name in her own time and would decide, in her own time, what was to be done with it, and that she was not at this hour willing to open it, because she suspected that once it was opened, it would demand of her a series of decisions she was not, at this hour, prepared to make well, and that she preferred, on the whole, to make decisions well rather than quickly. She said that she would take the paper into her own keeping, if he would permit it, and that she would give him her word that she would not open it before morning, and that she would send for him at whatever hour she had opened it, so that he would not be in this house a man kept waiting. She said this without emphasis. She did not touch the paper. He watched her while she spoke. When she had finished, he said, "Madam, of course." He did not, however, push the paper toward her. He said at last that there was one further thing, and that he had not, in truth, sent for her only about the paper. Outside, the rain, which had been falling in a small steady rhythm, changed its rhythm. It became, in one abrupt lift of the wind, heavier, and it drove against the long window at the west side of the room with the sound of something impatient at a shutter, and the fire in the grate flinched and recovered, and the candle on the mantel guttered once and did not go out, and Evienne, sitting in her chair with her hands folded in her lap and the ring on its black cord riding above the collar of her dress, understood, without wishing to understand, that she had come at last into the sustained late-hour weather-lashed room the whole of the fortnight had been walking her toward, and that a thing was about to be said in it that could not, once said, be taken back, and that she was going to have to sit still while it was said, because a woman who fled a room at the moment a truth arrived in it was a woman who admitted the truth by fleeing. She did not flee. She said, in the same voice, "My lord." He rose. He crossed, in one measured step, from his chair to the edge of the hearth rug, and he stopped there, and he said, "Madam, I have not come very much closer to you tonight, and I do not intend to come very much closer, because I would not have you mistake the offer for the offering, and I would not have you feel, in this room and at this hour, that a man of my rank is standing over you while he speaks." He said, "I would rather stand at this distance and be understood at this distance and be refused, if I am to be refused at this distance, than come one step nearer and be believed for the wrong reason." He said, "Will you allow me to speak?" She said, "My lord, I will." He said, "I did not come to this house for the shooting." He said, "I did not come for my cousin." He said, "I did not come to make trouble under his roof, and I did not know, when I came, that I would find any trouble here that would need to be made." He said, "I came because a mutual acquaintance had described to me, 3 months ago, a woman at the foot of a table in a house not far from mine who had turned a public humiliation into a subscription for a school, and who had done it so quietly that the man at the head of the table had not heard her do it, and I came because I did not, upon hearing this, believe her, and I came because when I did not believe her, I discovered that I was angry with myself for not believing her, and I came because a man who is angry with himself for not believing a woman he has never met is a man who has already, without his consent, begun to believe her, and I wished, on my honor, to see for myself whether she existed." He took a small, measured step closer to her chair. He said, "Madam." He said, "She existed." He said, "And having found her, I did what any man of my temper would do. I asked her a question about drainage. I asked her a question about drainage because it was the only pretext I could invent for standing 3 mornings a week in a room in which she was going to be, and because it was a question I truly needed answered, and because I had been told all my life that I was a man who did not easily grant his attention, and I discovered, in 3 mornings a week in that room, that I did not have to grant it, that it had gone out of me on its own before I had had the chance to withhold it, and that the withholding had never, in the event, been mine to perform. He took another small measured step closer. He said, "Madam," he said, "I am not making you a declaration tonight." He said, "I have not that right." He said, "You are, in the plainest fact, another man's wife. And I do not intend to sit in this house and use your father's honor, which we have this afternoon defended, as a lever with which to prize you out of a marriage that is not mine to prize." He said, "I have too much respect for you, and, in a matter you may not credit, too much respect for myself, to make my case to you while your case is still being made against you elsewhere in the house." He said, "But I would not be honest with you, and I have discovered, madam, that I do not have any wish to be less than honest with you, if I did not tell you tonight, at this hour, in this room, that I have never in my life asked a question of a woman that I did not know the answer to before I asked it, and that in the 3 mornings a week of the last month, I have asked you, madam, more questions I did not know the answer to than I have asked any other person alive, and that this is not a small thing in a man of my kind, and that I would not have you learn it from anyone but me." He took a third small measured step closer, and he was now standing at the arm of her chair, and he did not put his hand on the arm of the chair, and he did not sit down beside her, and he did not touch her, and Evienne, who had by then stopped breathing without noticing that she had stopped, understood, with the small cold clarity of the lantern on her interior floor, that the distance he had refused to cross was the whole of his declaration, and that a man who declined to close the distance while telling a woman that he loved her was, in the private code her father had used and taught her, a man who was to be believed. He said, "Madam," he said, "I do not ask you for anything tonight." He said, "I ask you only to know that I have said this, and that I will say it again, at any hour, and in any room in which you will hear it, when the time comes that you are free to hear it, and that until that time I will be, in this house and in every house we happen to share, exactly what I have been for the last month, a man in a chair opposite yours with a report on his knee, and I will not, on my honor, be less." He said, "I have finished." She sat. She did not, at first, answer him. She looked at the fire. She looked at the paper on the table between them. She looked at her own hands in her lap, at the ring on its black cord riding above the collar of her dress, at the small, worn silver band, and the plain river garnet the color of steeped tea. And she thought of her mother in the low kitchen with the black kettle. And she thought of the 8 words shaped like a piece of kitchen advice. A woman who tends the roots owns the harvest. And she thought of the small, dry sentence she had made herself in this house. 2 keys and 1 heart. And she thought of the word useful the Duke had used in the corridor, and of the word wife he had used that afternoon with visible effort, and of the word madam this man had just used 4 times in a row without a single time using it as a weapon. And she felt, at the base of her throat, the small hot pressure of a thing that had been kept down for 3 years, and was now, in the sustained late-hour weather-lashed room, asking, quietly and without insistence, to be let up. She did not let it up. Not yet. She said, in the voice she used for the bishop's wife, but pitched, this once, only for him, "My lord." She said, "I have heard you." She said, I will not, tonight, answer you. She said that she was not refusing him, and she was not accepting him because she was not, at this hour, in a position in which either refusal or acceptance would be honest, and that she owed him, after what he had said and after the manner in which he had said it, honesty. She said that she had, in the course of the last month, learned to expect at 11 in the morning a knock at the door of her small parlor, and had learned to look forward to the knock, and had made herself examine the looking forward, and had found, at the bottom of it, not the fluttering foolishness she had been taught to fear, but a small, steady pleasure that felt uncomfortably like being seen, and that she had put the pleasure aside, because a woman who did not know what her own pleasures cost her was a woman who would eventually be sold one at a price she could not pay, and that she had been sold enough. She said that she was not, tonight, going to allow herself to be seen by him, and to accept, in the being seen, an offer he had not yet made, because she would rather be a woman who had earned, by the small daily labor of her own composure and her own competence, the right to be looked at, than a woman who had been picked up in a moment of pity at the end of a bad day. She said that she required of herself that any answer she gave him be given after she had put her own house in order, and that until she had put her own house in order, she was not, in her own estimation, a woman whose answer was worth having. She said that she asked him, if he would grant her this, to wait. She said, in the same voice, that she would not ask him to wait long. She said, "My lord, I have not, in 3 years, said as much as this to any person under this roof." She said, "Take that, if you will, as my answer for tonight." He did not move. He did not, when she had finished, come the small remaining distance to her chair. He stood where he had stood. He said, "Madam." He said, "I will wait." He said, "At whatever length." He said, "And I will not, in the waiting, presume upon it." He said, "Will you take the paper?" She said, "I will." She rose. She crossed the small distance between them, and she picked up the folded paper from the table, and she did not open it, and she slid it, without ceremony, inside the collar of her dress beside the ring, and she felt, against her skin, the small dry rustle of it, and she thought, well, that is one more thing to keep. She said, "My lord." She said, "You have been kind." She did not, in saying kind, use the word as she had heard it used in the drawing room of this house, as a courtesy with a hidden price folded inside it. She used it in the way her mother had used it in the low kitchen, as a word for the thing which was startling and precious in a world that had, in general, no reason to be either. He said, "Madam." He said, "It was not kindness." She said, "My lord, I will decide what it was." He inclined his head. She said, "Good night." He said, "Good night." She went to the door. At the door she turned. She said, "My lord." She said, "I said I would not answer you tonight." She said that she would not, in fairness, leave the room without saying one thing that was not an answer, and was, nevertheless, a truth, because she did not wish him to sit up in whatever room he had been given in this house, believing that she had walked past what he had said without hearing it. She said, in the voice she used for the bishop's wife, but pitched, once more, only for him, that in 3 years no one in this house had asked her a question, the answer to which they did not already know, and that he had, in a single sentence, told her that he had asked her 100, and that this had been said to her at 11 o'clock in the morning 3 mornings a week for a month before he had ever said it to her at this hour in this room, and that she had, if he wished to know, heard it the first morning and had heard it every morning since. She said, "My lord, take that, if you will, with you." She went out. She closed the door behind her. Mrs. Enderby, from the still room at the end of the passage, saw her come out, and did not speak, and did not follow, and Evian walked back along the corridor to the staircase with the correct, unhurried tread of a duchess who had been sent for on a household matter and had, on the whole, resolved it, and she went up the stairs and along the corridor to her own room, and she went in. And she closed the door, and she stood, for one breath, with her forehead against the cool painted wood, and then she straightened. Because a woman who leaned on doors was a woman who was learning to lean, and she went to the small looking glass above the washstand, and she looked at herself, and she saw, in the glass, a woman in a dove-colored silk dress with a plain black cord at her throat, and a folded paper against her heart, and a very small, quiet smile at the corner of her mouth that she had not put there and could not, when she tried, take away. And she sat down at the dressing table, and she put her face in her hands, and she wept, once, for the length of 8 breaths that she counted. And then she stopped. Because a woman who tended the roots did not spend the harvest on weeping, and she washed her face, and she went to bed. In the morning, she opened the paper. The name inside it was Lady Merritt's companion, a thin, quiet woman named Cassia Pruitt, who had come into the house 2 years earlier as a poor cousin of the Verley family, and had, in that time, made herself so useful to Lady Corisande and so agreeable to Lady Merritt that no one in the house had ever thought to look at her, which was, Evian thought, precisely the reason to have looked at her, and precisely the reason she had been chosen. The paper trail, Lord Cassian had noted in 3 lines on the back of the same sheet, went from Miss Pruitt to a writing master to the merchant house, and included, at the merchant house, a small further sum promised on the day the Duke should be, in the phrase Miss Pruitt had used in her own hand on the receipt, at liberty. Evian read this twice. She refolded the paper. She went down to breakfast. She said good morning to Lady Merritt, who had come down early again, and to Miss Pruitt, who had come down with her, and she asked Miss Pruitt, with grave courtesy, whether she had slept well, and Miss Pruitt, who had not expected to be spoken to, and who had been trained, in 2 years, to be pleasantly not spoken to, said that she had, thank her grace, and Evian buttered her toast. Sir Ambrose came down at 9. Lord Cassian came down at 1:30. The Duke did not come down. At 10, Evian asked Peter, in a voice that carried no further than the sideboard, to request that the Duke join her in the small library at 11, in the presence of Sir Ambrose and Lord Cassian, and to request that the Duke bring with him Lady Corisande and Lady Merritt and Miss Pruitt. Peter, who understood by now the shape of what was being asked of him, inclined his head. At 11, they came. Evian did not sit. She stood by the fire, in the same dove-colored silk, with the ring on its black cord above the collar of the dress, and she said, in the voice she used for the bishop's wife, that a matter had come to her attention which she wished to place before the family together, so that no member of the family should have cause, afterwards, to say that they had heard of it second-hand. She laid, on the table, the deed and the receipt from Mr. Halbert's package. She laid, beside them, the folded paper Lord Cassian had brought her, and she opened it, and she read out, in a level voice, the name of the writing master, and the sum and the words at liberty in the hand of Miss Pruitt. She did not look, when she read the name, at Miss Pruitt. She looked at Lady Corisande. Lady Corisande's short, bright laugh did not come. Lady Merritt went a shade paler under her rouge. Miss Pruitt, who had been trained to be pleasantly not spoken to, and had not been trained for this, sat very still, and, being not stupid, understood at once that her position in the house was over, and that the only remaining question was whether it was to be over quietly. Evian said in the same voice that she did not intend to prosecute. She said that she did not intend to prosecute because a prosecution would put her father's name in a court, and her father's name had, in her keeping, no business in a court. She said that she intended, instead, that Miss Pruitt should leave the house within the hour, in a carriage provided by Sir Ambrose, with a plain reference written by Sir Ambrose to a small position Sir Ambrose had, in the course of the morning, secured for her at a school in a town far from this county, in which she would be paid a modest wage and expected to work, and in which she would not, on Sir Ambrose's word, be permitted to correspond with any member of this household again, and that she should consider herself upon leaving to have received from the Marchbrook family a mercy she had not earned, and would not, if she were wise, test. She said that Lady Corisande should leave the house within the day, and should not return to it, and that the yellow diamond necklace, which had been paid for out of the household accounts of Ashenfell in a month in which those accounts had been managed by the Duchess of Ashenfell, should be left, on her departure, on the table in the front hall, and that if it were not so left the household would consider the matter one for the county sheriff, and that Lady Corisande, being not stupid either, would understand what was meant. She said that Lady Merritt should remain in the house and should sit, for the remainder of the year, at the small breakfast table opposite the woman she had helped, and should learn to say good morning to her without kissing her cheek. She said that she required the Duke to acknowledge, in the presence of this room and of Sir Ambrose, and of Lord Cassian, that the paper of the previous day had been the instrument of a design against his wife, and that he had entertained the instrument, and that the entertainment had been a failure of his part of the bargain that had been made between his family and hers, and that he would, within the week, restore to her the sole and exclusive management of the estates that had come with her name, together with a written instrument drawn by his solicitor and countersigned by Sir Ambrose, by which he undertook not to interfere in that management again. She said, and one further thing. She said, in the voice she used for the bishop's wife, quietly, that she required of him the withdrawal, before witnesses, of the sentence he had spoken in the corridor a month before, in which he had used the word useful of her as a man uses it of a table he no longer wishes to keep, and the substitution, in its place, of no sentence at all, because she did not, at this hour, wish to be described by him with any word whatever, and would prefer, on the whole, his silence. The Duke, standing at the far side of the room, looked at his wife for a long moment. His still face, which had been trained by generations of dukes, had by now given up the attempt to be still, and Evian saw in it neither the shame of the previous afternoon nor the calculation of the previous evening, but something plainer and older, the tired face of a man who had, some time ago, become smaller than the position he had inherited, and had discovered at last that the position could not be persuaded to shrink to fit him. He said, quietly, "Madam, I withdraw my name from you." He said it in the pleasant flat voice he had used for stewards and for horses. He said that if she wished it he would begin, within the week, the private steps by which their marriage might be, in the phrase the solicitors used, quietly undone, and that he would not oppose her in any of them, and that he would sign whatever she required. He said that he did not, in saying this, ask her pardon because he had not in 3 years earned the right to ask it. He said, in that case, "Madam, I withdraw." Evian, standing by the fire in the dove-colored silk, with the ring on its black cord above the collar of the dress, said in the same voice that she accepted the withdrawal and that she took back from him the dowry that had built his house. She said that she took it back in the plain sense, the drained meadow, the mill, the fields, the sums in the accounts in the city, the tapestries which had been bought with them and could be sold again, the pianoforte, the school at Marchbrook Fen with its roof to be mended in the spring, and the small brick house with the slate roof at the edge of her father's county, in which she had been born, and to which she now, at 26, intended to return, and from which she now, at 26, intended to run whatever she thereafter chose to run. She said that she did not take back the west wing roof, or the chapel slate, or the stables, because those were fixed to a house that was not hers, and she was not a woman who broke roofs, but that she took back, in principle and in the ledger, the credit for them, and that she would, within the month, cause a plain public statement to be printed in the county paper, naming the sums she had brought and the works they had built, so that the county should understand, from her own hand, what she had done for a house that had chosen to describe her as useful. She said, "That is all." She sat down. Sir Ambrose, from his chair, said, "Ashenfell, be so good as to leave the room." The Duke left the room. Lady Corisande left the room. Miss Pruitt, escorted by Peter, left the room. Lady Merritt, whose composure had not been trained for public correction, sat on and wept, quietly and without dignity, and Evian did not, in that moment, look at her, because a woman who watched another woman weep after correcting her turned the correction into cruelty, and the correction was more useful as correction. 6 months later, in the small brick house at the edge of her father's county, in the second week of a wet spring, Evian Marchbrook stood on the low stone step of the front door of a building she had ordered rebuilt with her own hand, watched the last cart of tiles unload, and thought that it had, in the end, been a matter of drainage. The school at Marchbrook Fen had a new roof. It had also, since the previous autumn, a new dormitory and a small library of 40 books, and a mistress with a decent wage, and a subscription list on which the names of every substantial landowner in the county appeared, and at the head of which appeared, in the small neat hand Evian's father had taught her, the name Evian Marchbrook of Marchbrook Fen. She had, at 27, taken her name back. She had taken it back in a simple document signed at a solicitor's office in the county town, in the presence of Sir Ambrose and of Mr. Halberd, and she had used it, since the signing, in every letter and every ledger. And the county, which had at first not known what to do with a woman who had put down a title and picked up her father's name, had, in the way of counties, decided within 3 months that it had always known what to do, and had settled on the decision that Miss Marchbrook of Marchbrook Fen was to be treated as a personage, and had begun, in the way of counties, to be right about her. The Duke of Ashenfell had gone, after the private steps had been quietly taken, to a smaller house on the coast, in the company of a housekeeper who was not Mrs. Enderby, and a manservant who was not Peter, and Ashenfell House itself, which he had not been able to keep up without the sums that had left it with his wife, had been let, for a term of years, to a manufacturer from the north with a large family and a genuine interest in tenants, and the tenants of Ashenfell, who had been Evian's care during her 3 years there, had written her a long letter signed by 29 hands to say that the new tenant was a decent man, and that they were, on balance, better off, and that they hoped she would come and see them in the summer, and Mrs. Enderby had signed the letter at the bottom, and Peter, whose name was Peter Ashcombe, and who was now the manufacturer's under-butler, at twice his old wage, had signed it below her. Lady Corisande Verley had married, within 4 months of leaving Ashenfell, a widower with 3 children and a competent income, and a house in a town none of her family had heard of, and had not been heard from since, and Lady Merritt, who had remained at Ashenfell as long as Ashenfell was Ashenfell, and had gone, when it was let, to live with an aunt in the city, had written Evienne one short letter, in a hand that was less trained than usual, in which she had said that she believed she had, in the course of 3 years, mistaken her sister-in-law for the sort of person who could be teased, and that she now understood that she had been wrong, and that she did not, in writing this, ask for anything, because she did not deserve to ask for anything, but wished her sister-in-law well, and Evienne, who had received the letter at the small brick house with the slate roof, had read it twice, and had folded it, and had put it in the drawer with the marriage settlement and her father's letter, and the first note in Lord Cassian's upright, unshowy hand, and had, that evening, written a reply of 3 lines in which she had told Lady Merritt that she wished her well also, and had signed it Evienne Marchbrook, and had sent it by the noon post, because a woman who tended the roots did not spend the harvest on grudges, and had returned to the drainage of the west field. On a bright day in the middle of that spring, in the small yard outside the school at Marchbrook Fen, the county gathered. It gathered because a plain notice had been printed a fortnight earlier in the county paper over the name of Miss Marchbrook, inviting any tenant, landowner, or interested party to attend the opening of the new dormitory and library and the formal naming of the school, and it gathered, more privately, because word had gone about that the Marquess of Halden, whose estate lay 2 counties to the north, and whose interest in the school had, over the winter, become the county's favorite quiet subject, would be present. The yard was full. There were tenants in their Sunday coats, and farmers' wives with their best bonnets, and children whom Evienne had, over the winter, come to know by name, and the schoolmistress in a new grey dress, and Sir Ambrose in the tweed of a country baronet, and Mr. Halberd in a black coat that was 2 years out of fashion, and looked exactly right, and the bishop, who had ridden over from his own diocese with a bag of books, and Mrs. Enderby, who had come down from her sister's cottage for the day, and was standing beside Peter Ashcombe at the back of the crowd. And, at the front, on a low platform that had been built for the purpose by the same carpenter who had made her mother's chair, Evienne Marchbrook, in a plain, dark blue gown, with the ring on its black cord at her throat, and a small bunch of hedgerow flowers in her hand that a child had given her at the gate, and that she had not been able to bring herself to put down. Lord Cassian Varin stood 2 paces behind her on the platform, as a man of his rank might properly stand at the ceremony of a friend, and no closer. He had been in the county for a week. He had, in that week, ridden over from his own estate every second day, and had called at the small brick house each time, and had drunk tea in the front parlor with Sir Ambrose and Evienne, and once with the schoolmistress, and had spoken of drainage and of tiles, and of a small brindled dog that had adopted him at Halden, and had not, in any of those visits, taken 1 step nearer to her than he had taken in the small library at Ashenfell on the night of the storm, and Evienne, who had not asked him to, had understood that he was, in his own way, keeping the promise he had made to wait, and had noted with a small dry pleasure that the promise had not, in the 6 months, cost him 1 visible impatience, and that this was itself a kind of proof. He stepped forward now to the edge of the platform. He said, in the low, even voice, that he would not detain them long. He said that he had been asked, by the committee of the school, to say a few words at the naming, and that he had accepted the invitation on the condition that he might, in speaking, address not the school, but the woman by whose labor the school had come to stand, because a school that had not been named for the person who had built it did not know its own name. He said, "And I ask you, on the condition, to indulge me." The yard, which had been noisy, quieted. He said, in the same voice, that 6 months before, in a house not far from this one, a woman had been described in a corridor by the man who had married her as useful. He said that the word had been meant at the time in the sense that a table was useful, or a set of accounts, or a pair of hands that could be put down when one had no more use for them. He said that he had, on the day the word had been used, been in the house, and had heard it repeated, and had, on hearing it, made 2 decisions in quick succession. He said, the first was to conclude that the man who had used the word had understood neither the woman he had used it of nor the word itself. He said, the second was to conclude that he, standing in the same corridor, had understood neither the word nor the woman any better, and to determine, before he left the house, that he would attempt to correct at least one of these 2 ignorances in himself. He said, they were wrong. He said it plainly. He said, they were wrong, all of them, and I was wrong with them, and I say so here, in this yard, at this hour, before the tenants of Marchbrook Fen, and before her uncle Sir Ambrose, and before Mr. Halberd, and before the bishop, and before Mrs. Enderby and Peter Ashcombe, and before the children she has taught to read. Because if the sentence is to be corrected, it should be corrected in the same volume in which it was spoken. And the corridor was quiet, and this yard is not. He said, they called her useful. He said, she is not useful. He said, in the voice that was almost but not quite dry, that she is precise, in the way that a good instrument is precise, so that when she says a field will drain, the field will drain, and when she says a roof will be mended in the spring, the roof is, as we see, mended, he said. She is merciful in the way that only a person who has been given no mercy of her own can be merciful, so that when a woman under her roof betrayed her, that woman was sent, not to a court, but to a school. He said, she is faithful, in the way that a woman who was taught by her mother in a low kitchen that a woman who tends the roots owns the harvest is faithful, so that she has tended, without ceasing and without applause, roots that were not hers to own, and has now at last come home to a harvest that is. He said, precise, he said, merciful, he said, faithful, he said. That is the sentence in place of the other, and I ask the county to write it down. He said, in a voice that was, for the first time in the 6 months, not the voice of the Marquis of Halden, but simply the voice of a man named Cassian, who had walked into a corridor and had, without meaning to, walked out of it changed, that the children of this school will inherit this county, and that the county they inherit will be the county Evian Marchbrook has made, and that this is the smallest legacy she will leave, and on his life, not the largest. He stopped. He stepped back the 2 paces to his place. The yard, which had been quiet, made the small sound a yard makes when a great many people have been holding their breath and have decided, together, to let it out, and then the applause began. And it was not the partial applause that had rewarded Lady Corasandi's wit in the drawing-room of Ashenfell, and it was not the courteous applause that had rewarded the bishop's speeches at the school's foundation stone the year before, and it was the applause of a county that had understood, at last, what had been done under its nose, and it went on for a length of time that Evian did not measure, because she was, at that moment, occupied with the small bunch of hedgerow flowers in her hand, and with the ring on its black cord at her throat, and with the fact that her eyes were wet, and that they were wet, this once, in the way her mother would have permitted, as truth reaching the surface, and not as collapse. When it was over, the schoolmistress led the children into the new dormitory, and the tenants went into the yard, and Sir Ambrose walked off with Mr. Halberd and the bishop toward the beer barrel that had been set up under the elm, and Mrs. Enderby, in the way of housekeepers, went to see whether the tea had been remembered, and Peter Ashcombe, in the way of under-butlers who had been trained by good housekeepers, went with her, and Evian stepped down from the platform, and Lord Cassian stepped down beside her, and they walked, at the same measured pace, across the yard toward the low stone step of the school's front door, where the wall gave a small sheltered corner, and where the noise of the yard did not quite reach. There, at the step, he stopped. He said, "Madam," he said, "I have kept my promise." He said, "I have waited." He said, "I have not asked." He said, "I will ask now." He said, "Will you marry me?" He said, and he said it before she could answer, that he would not have her mistake his asking. He said, "I do not ask because I am lonely at Halden, and because the small brindled dog is not company enough for a man of my temper." He said, "I do not ask because the county expects it of me, and because a man of my rank must, they say, at some hour choose a wife." He said, "I do not ask because you are, at this moment, at the height of your standing, and because a man is wise to attach himself to a rising name." He said, "I ask because for 6 months, in the mornings when I have ridden home from your parlor to my own, and no one has been in the yard to see, I have wanted, upon dismounting, to turn and ride back, and because in the evenings, when I have sat in my own library and no one has been in the room with me, I have wanted the chair opposite mine to have a woman in it who would tell me that a figure did not agree with a figure, and because when I have been, in these 6 months, alone, and no eye has been on me, I have thought of you, and I have wanted you. And a man who wants a woman when no one is watching is, in my experience of myself, a man who ought at last to say so." He said, "That is why I ask." He said, "Will you have me?" Evian Marchbrook, standing on the low stone step of a school she had rebuilt in the county in which she had been born, with the ring on its black cord above the collar of the dark blue gown, and the small bunch of hedgerow flowers still in her hand, looked at him for a long moment. She said, "My lord." She said, "Yes," she said, "because I wish it," she said, in the voice she had used for the bishop's wife, but pitched, at last, only for him, that she did not, in accepting, cease to be Evian Marchbrook, and did not intend to, and that she did not, in accepting, hand over the drainage of the West Field, or the accounts of the school, or the mill on the strong small river, and that a woman who tended the roots owned the harvest, and would continue, in his house, and in her own, to do both, and that she was not, in saying yes, saying it easily, because she had learned, in the last 3 years, that yes was a heavier word than no, and required more of a woman, and that she was saying it, nevertheless, because he had asked her the question in the form in which a woman could answer it, and because she had learned, in the 6 months, that a man who asked a woman a question in the form in which she could answer it was a man to whom, when her own house was in order, a woman could give her hand. She held out her hand. He took it. He did not let it go. Above them, over the roof of the school and the elm and the low stone wall of the yard, the last of the morning's rain, which had followed them through the ceremony as a small polite gray sheet at the west of the sky, moved off, and the sun, which had been waiting behind it in the way sun waits behind rain in this county in spring, came out, plainly and without ceremony, on a yard full of tenants and children, and a bishop and a country baronet, and a housekeeper and an under-butler, and a schoolmistress, and a small brick house at the edge of a county, and on a woman named Evian Marchbrook standing on a low stone step in a plain dark blue gown with a plain black cord at her throat and her hand in the hand of a man who had crossed the last small distance because she had at last permitted him to, And it was not perfect, and it was not easy, and it was simply shared, and that was more than enough. And she had been, from the corridor at Ashenfell to the yard at Marchbrook Fen, from the word useful to the word precise, from the ring on its black cord to the hand not let go, always worth believing in. And the county, at last, believed her, and the sun on the wet slate of the new roof lit the yard the color of steeped tea, and their joined hands, in the dawn after the storm, turned together toward the open door of the school and the years beyond it.